Hello and good morning,
Hello.
Bowerbirders.
Good morning.
Hi, how are you, Ben?
Good morning, Nick. I'm good. How are you?
Oh, very good.
Good. All
What are
right,
we going to talk
podcast
about
over.
today?
Oh, sorry. Today we're going to talk. I guess it's a follow-up episode to our history of architectural publishing. It's the state of architectural publishing and a little bit of what might be coming as well.
Yeah, so we want to dig into some of the big changes, which people may not realize. If you just consume publications, you probably don't understand the mechanics of how a publication works and all the wheelings and dealings behind the scenes. So we want to delve into some pretty big trends, some big revenue shifts, some of the tidal waves that have been hitting publications. We're going to delve into what seems to be a consolidation phase where a lot of publications have been bought and sold, and there's changes happening there and why that's happening, and combine that all in with, I guess, the technology that's pushing publications in certain directions and forcing them to change. Now,
Yeah, I don't think anyone thinks as much about this stuff as we do. I can't imagine anyone else thinks about architectural publishing as a niche and then does all of this. I mean, if there is someone out there, there's someone out there who spends as much time thinking about this stuff as us, we should talk to them because it would be a really fascinating conversation for us and for no one else, probably.
now we should mention that we talk to a lot of people, so we have a lot of internal conversations which we can't publicly share. So we've heard the stories of some of these transitions. So what we've done in this scenario is we've asked AI to do some deep research and to pull all this information together so that we can see a trend line, and then we'll filter it with, I guess, a simplified version of what we think might be going on behind the scenes based on some of our conversations, but without having to name anybody or be too specific about it.
Just like all good journalists, we will not name our sources.
So, where do you want to begin? It feels like the time frame is probably the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, chronologically, where do we want to begin? I think it's probably worth us going over again the business model just very quickly, the business model of publishing and how the whole thing works, because I think a lot of architects maybe don't think about it a lot. Probably, it all makes sense, but it'd be good to go over how do publications make money?
Yeah. Well, I think traditionally people think of them as making money from print advertising, like the big ad that you might see in a magazine, and then probably thinking of that as shifting into digital advertising, which people may or may not understand at the same level, because that's a little bit different with Google Ads and different ad networks and so forth. But there's actually quite a few ways that publications make money, and that's because they've had to shift because of external forces. Chapter one is probably starting off with, you have the rise of all these websites coming. So when was that? About 2000, you start to see them. And then 2008, you have really this massive expansion. Then we're fast forwarding, let's say 10 years to about 2020. And there's another shift happening, which is that's the interesting bit. Like, we all know there's websites, but what people probably don't realize is there's a lot of internal conversations that have happened over the last 5 years as these publications try to figure out what happens next. Like, how does Instagram impact them? How does AI impact them? Do
TikTok.
publications even exist? So that leads back to the revenue streams, because they've all changed. It's doubt print advertising has much of an impact anymore. This is my guess.
Yeah, I think my experience tells me that what happened when websites first came out, which is when I was cutting my teeth in the industry, there were these dedicated websites for architecture and design. And what happened was that online advertising became this add-on. So the publishers would go, look, here's a print ad, but we're also going to give you some online advertorial. We're going to give you some ads online. So it became a package of content. But what happened in a very short period of time, like maybe 5 years, was that the revenue kind of got distorted. So it's like, we're selling a print ad, but we can't sell that print ad without online ads. And so the value from the advertiser's perspective was moving much more towards digital. The reason for that is that digital is measurable. You can actually put, you see how much money you put in, you see how many inquiries you get out. So it was a much more attractive way of advertising than here's a page in a magazine and we don't actually know how many people looked at that. So I think that was probably the biggest shift. And then for a really long time, it was this online is just there as an add-on rather than the actual product. And then we ended up with people going like Dazine and these online only websites where it was all digital advertising.
So do you think it started off, you've got an add-on there where they're not really valuing online as much? Over time, did that completely flip? Where
I don't think it's completely flipped. So, I mean, it can't, because those print publications are still selling ads, and those ads are the real driver of revenue. It's not the price that you pay when you go to the newsagent. That's not the revenue driver. It's the advertising. So I say a lot of publishers are still doing package work like that. So you get print and online and all these things, and we're just going to sell you that as a package. We're not going to give you an itemized list of where that money is going. But I don't think you can sell print ads now without a digital component.
I think it's the diversification of revenue. Yeah. And so having moved away from purely print ads to then publications asking themselves, how else do we make money? And what does it mean to be a magazine in the world of the internet? Because when you have all this traffic and you've got competitors like Google, who's completely changing what ads mean, same as Facebook, Instagram, and those platforms are 100% measurable, which means that if you put $1 in, you can see if you get $2 out. Unlike print magazine, where there's definitely value there, but trying to measure that is a very hard game. I remember back in the day, didn't they try all sorts of things?
Yeah, so the really the only way that ever worked, until I guess QR codes might be an exception nowadays. I don't see a lot of ads with QR codes on them because they're generally ugly. But yeah, in the old days, you would have a separate phone number. You would actually get a separate phone line installed for your advertising so that you could measure the effectiveness of that. Not many people did that, and I think over time, publishers sort of directed people, in my opinion, to the right way to think about it, which is that it's a presence, so it's branding. You're not there to get inquiries from a print publication. You're there to be present. You are there next to an amazing project. You've got this ad for, your furniture or your product sitting there. And so it's that idea of, if you're not there and your competitors are, what does that say about you? So it's a real sort of FOMO thing. But generally, a lot of design publications, they also have really high quality advertising, as in the aesthetic of it matches with the publication. It's not just some random ad that they've inserted in. So I think it is a real branding exercise. And for a lot of people, that's enough to spend quite a lot of money on. But again, I would be very, very skeptical if every print publication doesn't have a digital component that they add into a print advertising package.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head before when you're talking about packages. I think that's where it started to shift. My guess is, obviously, the internet's taking off maybe around that 2010 mark. And then you have these established brands who are trying to reposition themselves. And you start to see things like awards programs start to pop up, where this is a different revenue stream. Or you have events. Like, events are a huge part of publications now. And the question is, so what is a publication? It's shifting. And it's working more like a brand now. So you have this brand which has high status, high respect, but it does lots of things. It happens to have a print magazine. It happens to have an online presence. It happens to have a physical presence in the real world. And that's all coming together as a package.
I think if you look back at the evolution of this stuff, essentially print publications, the thing that they did really well, so like any print publication is going to have a production manager, basically. So someone who manages the production of the print publication, because there's physical stuff. You got to have paper. You got to have the ability to distribute your magazines, all of these things that someone needs to be on top of. So you'd have that production manager. And when you start to translate that into digital, you don't really need the production managers in the same way in digital. You end up with people who are, basically maintaining a pretty straightforward blog style website. But those skills do transfer into things like events, into, speaker series, into things like Saturday in Design or Clerkenwell Design Week in.
So these are like larger events.
Yes.
So multi-day events and festivals.
Exactly. So you need, sorry, there's Alexa. I don't know if you picked up on that. Alexa's telling me someone's here. Yeah. So the production of a magazine is actually similar in a lot of ways to, or the skills are similar to producing an event and producing an awards program. All of those things sort of tie in quite well together. So when you start to look at the components of sorry, can I think I need to go and answer this.
Just pause.
Sure.
And we are back. Sorry, we had a small interruption there.
Yeah, it was an emergency. It was a random parcel at the front door. This is the challenge of working from home.
So I think we were talking about how publications had moved into packages and providing other services like events, which really is still trying to connect these two groups. So the advertisers with an audience. It's just they're changing the mediums and they're jumping from print, they're jumping to events. And this is becoming more of a brand company rather than what people would think of as printed magazines.
It's a really interesting way of looking at it, actually, is that publications, their only job is building an audience and retaining that audience so that they can then sell access to that audience. So when you think about a publisher like that, rather than the particular medium, it's really clear. You're trying to get access to that audience, and that's why there's value in that to you.
And the forces behind publications is always technology and audiences shifting and changing. So whenever you have a new technology come in, you have opportunity, but you have disruption. And so there must be a phase whenever the technology comes in, but now it feels like maybe every 10 years, you're having a technology disruption. Therefore, as a publisher, you're figuring out how you adapt to it and survive and keep going. So that's the background. What I find really interesting is like trying to figure out what's happening right now. And when I say right now, I think there's been behind the scenes, there's been sort of rumors and things have changed probably for about 5 years, which we pick up on, but probably nobody else sees. So we'll have conversations with people and somebody is selling a publication or they're opting to get out, or there's a shift in the industry and there's some rumblings that, the economics isn't stacking up and they're having to change how they're working. And there's been a lot happening in the last, since about 2017, we've seen a lot of change in who owns publications and how they're working.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, like a lot of people might not be aware because in most of the examples, the brands have stuck around. So they haven't actually changed the brand or the publication name hasn't changed. So you might not even be aware that a lot of this stuff has happened.
Yeah, and obviously the purpose is to stay positive and to be a good public-facing brand. So they can't really publicly talk about the internal battles which are going on in a lot of publications now. And I say this, I'm using this across the industry because I've had enough conversations with people now where it feels like there is a trend shift with almost all publications as they try to grapple with what's going to happen in the future. We got AI to help us create a big list of some of these changes which had occurred since about 2017. So they start just before the pandemic, but then they really ramp up. Like there's definitely a trend there. Something hit hard around 2020 to 2022 and everyone was going, I'm out or I'm shifting or I'm buying. So the list we've got here, and please, if some of these dates are slightly incorrect, we blame AI, but this is what we've got so far. So in 2017, we see the Architect's Journal and Architectural Review is purchased by Metropolis International,
which is separate to Metropolis magazine, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's confusing. I think it's a European company, might be in Belgium, correct me if I'm wrong. But just to confuse you a little bit more, in 2019, Metropolis magazine is purchased by Sandow. So Sandow, we know quite well, they're a large publisher. They have a whole stable of publications. And so this is starting to see this theme of probably consolidation of smaller brands going into larger publishing houses. In 2020, we see Arc Daily is purchased, and this is a confusing one, but basically we've got Arc Daily and we've got Architonic. They're coming together, but they're being purchased by another brand on top.
I think the order actually, my memory, this is all off my memory.
Yeah.
So, trust my memory as much as you trust AI. But I believe that Architonic was purchased by, I think it's called NZZ or something, a larger group.
Zurich,
so that was
based out of
purchased.
Zurich.
Yeah. Swiss. Yeah. So they purchased Architonic, which was Architonic's much more product focused. So they purchased that, and then whether Architonic acquired Arc Daily or whether the larger company acquired Arc Daily, either way, they merged. So that was, when was that? That was 2020. And
2020.
Then I think they acquired Design Boom later, like maybe even like 2023 or 2022 or something.
Yeah. And so this is where you start to see these strategies come out by, I guess, these larger companies who are buying up multiple brands and then packaging them underneath, one company.
Sorry, you go.
There's going to be different strategies by different publishers. I'm not sure if they're packaging them all up as advertise with us and you get access to all three, or if they're just collecting a stable of like-minded publications. Maybe it's easier to manage or to understand those markets, or if they're completely independent. I'm not sure how that's working in that case.
Yeah.
But I
think what's interesting about that one, that sort of acquisition and consolidation, is that it was quite, not speaking out of school here, but the strategy of acquiring Architonic, which was very product focused, Arc Daily, which is very sort of architecture industry focused, and then Design Boom, which is very design, the wider world of design, that they're not just architecture, they're also product design and, graphic design, all these other things. So I think that was a real conscious effort to bring three separate audiences that might have some crossover, to bring them together. And again, that's the interesting thing when you start to think about a larger publisher purchasing three publications. What are they doing? They're adding those audiences together. So yes, there is the potential there. Again, we don't know whether they've actually done this, but there's the potential there to essentially create your own advertising network as well, where you can sort of sell across all three platforms. And that is, again, a consolidation effort.
I assume it's more efficient too with advertising teams to be able to potentially have one advertising team, and now you've got the option of selling across all three platforms or however many magazines that you have. So in 2021, we see Dezeen that was purchased by JP Politiken Media Group. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
I can always guarantee you didn't.
This is starting to see that most of the large brands that people will know at home are being bought up and consolidated into larger companies of some sort in this period.
Yeah.
2021, we've just seen the start of the pandemic. So I don't know if there's any correlation there, but we do know that during this period, advertising revenue dropped, especially in print. So I imagine print magazines, nobody's walking into news agencies to be able to buy anything in print. It must have been a really hard time to get those businesses to survive. Whereas I imagine online potentially was much stronger. Just complete speculation here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that marries up with the industry, the publishing industry as a whole. I think print was still, I guess people were still buying magazines online. I think that it's really just a continuation of the overall shift towards digital consumption of most of your media. So.
Then we've got 2022. This is an interesting one. We've got Architizer, and it's bought by Material Bank. Now, Architizer is not a traditional publisher. It's more of a portfolio site. It has content. It does similar things to a publisher. It's got the A+ awards, and then it's been bought by essentially a startup. Startup as in it was quite large by that point, which is
a tech company.
A tech company, which is Material Bank, which sends samples out to architects. So This was a really fascinating one. because this is a combination which is very different to just here's a lot of puzzles all being grouped. This feels far more strategic, where they're purchasing the users and the audience and the marketing to be able to drive into the other company.
Yeah, I almost feel like it was I've got no inside information on this, but I think it was Material Bank purchasing an audience to serve their additional product. That seems to be what's happened there, that you've got someone who's already producing content, already got a big audience, and you're just wanting to tap into that. So I suspect that's what the acquisition was all about there.
Then in 2022, we've got Dwell, purchased by Recurrent Ventures, which I don't know if that's a venture firm or a publisher. But
I don't think it's a publisher, but they may have other publishing products. I'm just trying to remember.
You're going to do
so
a
they
quick
call themselves
search?
a digital media company.
Interesting.
So yeah, what does that mean? Nowadays, what does that mean? It could be any number of things.
Yeah, I think a lot of these larger companies, they're like an umbrella company and they manage quite a few things underneath. Then in 2023, we have Design Milk, which was bought out by Sandow. And so Sandow had also purchased Metropolis magazine a couple of years earlier. So you can see there's a trend in some of these publishers again.
And Design Milk was actually, so it was purchased by, actually think randomly an Australian like venture capital company or something. And when that happened, they sort of tried to shift into e-commerce a bit more. They already had e-commerce, but they pushed on that. And then it was then purchased again by Sandow.
Yes, that is right. I remember a conversation around that. And then we have, in 2024, we have Houses magazine here in Australia, which was fully purchased by the AI. So they had always had a 50% stake. They ended up buying the other 50%. The background there is that the owners were getting older. I think they had wanted to sell for quite a long time. I think there is a theme through some of these that we know where the founders were, they'd been doing this for a long time. And so most of them had been running a publication for 10 or 20 years. And it seems like there was a moment when larger companies were coming along and saying, we can buy you out. So that's probably one of the triggers where being bought out like that probably doesn't come along all the time. And so it's choosing your time.
And if you're tired,
if
they get you at the right time when you're like at the 10-year mark, I wouldn't mind dipping out.
Yeah. And so, it's interesting because you're moving from founder-led publications into corporate publications. The game is changing. So founders often are very passionate. They know their business inside and out, very detail orientated. Maybe not always business orientated, but that's debatable. Some publications...
Depends where they've come from. Some of the people who founded these publications were architects, designers themselves. Some of them actually came out of publishing. So yeah, there's lots of different stories.
And then we've clearly got this shift with COVID where a lot of these publications were redlining for some time, where they're using more money than what they're making because the advertising revenue has shifted, which triggers you need to figure out how to make money in a different way. So you start to see a lot of conversations behind the scenes of how are they going to shift and what are they going to do. And this is where you start to see paywalls pop up. And this isn't just architecture. This is everywhere. Like we see like a lot of the big newspapers now, they had shifted earlier. I think places like New York Times, they had done quite a long time ago, had moved to a paywall model. This is not unfamiliar territory either. This is very similar to about 100 years ago, where newspapers had shifted from buy you a newspaper off the corner street, for a penny, and moving towards a subscription model where you pay for the month and now you get your articles or your newspaper every single day. So paywalls are interesting like this. One of the things I'm curious about is the change of audience with paywalls, because paywalls to me seem, in architecture at least, something that architects would pay for. I'm curious whether or not the general public are paying for paywalls to gain access to different articles. What do you think?
I think what's interesting with a lot of these paywalls, thinking about some newspapers, they'll often give away a certain amount of content free because you also need to let people in to see how good the content is. And I think within architecture and design, it's kind of no different. You still need to have a certain amount of free content or content that you can consume and come to the website. I think what's really interesting, that there was a promise made, when all of this digital paywall stuff came in of, oh, well, you can get some advertiser free content, content without advertising. And then they quickly realized that they couldn't do that because you end up cannibalizing your income. And so it's really hard to have that shift. So now I think everyone understands that even if you're going through a paywall, there's going to be ads, display ads at least on the other side as well.
Well, publications were also looking for other avenues. Some that I had picked up on was, I saw one today, which somebody is releasing a new website for competitions, which was interesting. And I don't know if that's a paid platform or if that is just here's some more information. And
when you say competitions, you mean for like buildings that will
architectural
be built?
Yeah, I think it's finding all the competitions.
Okay, yeah.
Which we've seen some of these strategies roll out or attempted over the years. The other one is always a recruitment. So where a publication goes, I've got this large audience, maybe I can help architects recruit staff. It must work to some extent, but my gut feeling is probably hasn't been a huge success because they seem to come and go over time. Whereas I mean, there are still examples that keep going, but it's a question. Yeah, it's interesting it would be really interesting to know if it raises revenue or if it's actually an audience engagement tool more than anything else. Yeah, there's also, I think some publications have created like professional networks, so pay to be part of a network because they've obviously figured out that their audience is architects. So how do we give value to them in exchange for a membership fee? But it still comes down to this question of, do you want to be getting published to an audience of architects or do you want to be getting published to the general public and where your clients are?
Yeah.
So in my mind, this is a fascinating shift in what's happening with architectural publishing. So alongside this is content is changing and we're going away from simply here's a project, which is what the staple content has been for, let's say, 10 years, and more detailed stories like architectural news or more critique or more detailed stories. But those stories, I would be guessing, are more tailored towards other architects. So publications must be having to make a choice of going, who are you serving? Which audience are you going to attract? And betting on one or the other.
Yeah, I think in my mind, the most successful publishers are the ones who are diversifying. So they have within their audience, so their overall audience, they have a events audience, they have a speaker series audience, they have an awards audience. And yeah, there's lots of crossover in that, but that diversification means that if they lost something, they're not losing a huge chunk of every audience, if you know what I mean. They can retain those people in different places.
Well, they're hedging.
Yeah.
So they're diversifying so they're more stable so that if they lose revenue in one of those columns, they don't fall over completely.
Yeah.
Which basic business. Yeah. You're trying to make sure that you can survive a downturn in one of those areas. So there's also the content is changing in the sense of like the physical type of content, not just text and some photos, but moving towards video. This keeps coming up in our conversations where video is this stream where we're seeing it it's leading some publications, like something like the Local Project. Like their core value proposition in the early days was all about video. Like they were doing something which really stood out from everybody else. And that's led to what they are now and other publications copying that model of basically providing content, not even just the display of video, but the creation of video and moving into media production. That's the other thing that people probably don't realize is that the publishers are shifting away from just curating content to actually creating content. That must be a hard bet if you're doing international magazines and trying to get content from all over the world.
I think what's interesting from a lot of our conversations, again, we have a lot of conversations with a lot of journalists and different people within publishing, is that the journalists Well, the editorial still seems to be really important. So essentially quarantined off, like we're not going to touch too much of the editorial. Let's just keep doing what works because that audience is right. There are some exceptions here where people are sort of restructuring their editorial teams, but really the vision of the editorial of a lot of those publications, so the content that they're creating for the original blog or magazine, they try not to touch that too much. And it is more of this additive thing where it's like, okay, we're probably not going to spend more money on our editorial, but we're going to hire a bunch of video producers and editors. We're going to hire content creators, digital content creators, start to build up that side of the business. So I know that there are editorial teams that have been cut back quite substantially. That is happening a lot, continues to happen. We're seeing a lot more freelancers entering the market as well, which generally suggests that they've either chosen to or have been pushed from editorial positions into freelancing. So yeah, there's a bit of change.
Well, we saw Architect Magazine, which is the magazine of the American Institute of Architects. They went all digital in 2024, which, to my surprise, that hasn't occurred all that much over the last 15 years. You would have thought with the rise of online publications that many publications would just have ditched print altogether.
Actually, there's probably a lot more than you would think. Most of them were in that early phase, so around that 2008 period. So there was the interesting thing with a lot of those was people went, oh my God, I can take this thing that costs a lot of money to produce a print publication and I can create, back then they used to call them online magazines. Like that was seriously how they did it. And you would have these, I don't know if people still use them, but you would have these sort of digital flip books. So they would lay it out like a magazine, but they just wouldn't do the actual production of that print publication. I think all of that died. I mean, I could be wrong. There may still be some that are out there, but I don't know that it's the most popular way to.
It was one of those ideas which was really cool for about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
The UI of being able to flip through a book, but you're on a screen. It doesn't make any sense.
And you could actually grab it at the corner, like right click, left click, whichever one it is, and you could drag the page. So you'd sit there going,
but it was a really annoying click, which
incredibly annoying. Yeah.
And
you had to zoom in to be able to read the text because it didn't fit on your screen. It was not a good place to be. I mean, those things still exist for PDFs and stuff like that, but I don't think there are many digital magazines out there still.
Strangely enough, we are seeing a reemergence of print. So we see Local Project, for example, has a book that they've released. I see that in Melbourne all over the place. Like you go to a bookstore and it's proudly presented in the window display. It's also Tiny Homes.
Never too small.
They had released, is it a book or a magazine?
I think it's a magazine. Oh, sorry, they did two. I think they've done 2 books and now they've also done a magazine. So they started off as a YouTube channel looking at small apartment living basically in cities. And then they launched a book and then they went, cool, let's get into print. And so now they've got a print publication. The other one is here in Australia is the Design Files, quite well-known sort of more lifestyle, but very design-focused publication. They now have a print publication. I think they've already done books, but I think they might be doing a regular magazine now. Could be wrong. Should probably double check that. So yeah, it's funny to see these digital first publications, products, brands move into the print sphere.
My guess is there's something, it's almost like vintage nostalgia with this stuff. It's in my world, I'm playing with vintage lenses and cameras, and now I'm curious about vintage watches. And there's something about that era where the technology has moved past whatever that was, but there's something beautiful about it because you can touch it, you can play with it. It's something that you can hold in your hand. That I think is coming back in books as well, where you are bombarded with social media posts. There is something beautiful about having a well-made book in front of you that feels like you're slowing down and appreciating the consumption of this content. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that happen a little bit more. It probably isn't a huge volume sort of area of publishing.
I
But
mean, yeah, without knowing the numbers, I mean, when you've got an audience, a digital audience that's that big, and you can go, okay, well, maybe we're going to be able to convert 10% of our audience into print subscribers. That's a very different proposition. You almost don't need to be on the newsstands. I'm sure they are. But when you've got a big enough audience that you're then driving to buying essentially a product, a physical product, I think it could be the right way to go.
what it also does is it creates a really strong emotional connection. Unlike everything online, which is you're being bombarded, you may associate that with the brand, especially if the brand has a personality or something that distinguishes it. Unlike a book, though, a book is sitting in your house. So you buy a book by this brand that you love, you take it home, it sits on your coffee table. Every time you walk into your house, you see that brand, and it becomes more than just the online. So strategically, maybe getting back into print is a good idea for these companies who are essentially brand companies.
Well, it was quite interesting recently. Dazine did a newspaper, print newspaper thing for one of the design events in Europe. I can't remember where, I don't think it was Milan, but it was one of those. So they created a newspaper that they distributed during the event. When they were selling that, when they were talking about that on social media, on LinkedIn, it sounded like they were launching a print edition, print publication. I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see more of those digital publications like Dazine starting to get more into physical, tangible stuff again.
So shifting gears a little bit and coming back to how people who are trying to get published, what they can learn from this, because this is obviously very technical and we're focusing largely on publishers and the machinations of that industry. But what it means for people who are trying to optimize their chances of getting published, because it would seem like stories are changing and basic project content is probably not going to be enough.
Yeah, I think the obvious one is video. Anyone who is able to leverage video in a good way. And you know what? I've actually got some advice here, because this is one of those things that bothers me about some videos that are being produced by publishers at the moment, is that they're not focusing on story. They think that sitting someone in front of a camera and getting them to talk about a project equals story. They'll have these things where they have like a sweeping shot and, a zoom in, zoom out shot of a piece of architecture or something. I'm like, that's not storytelling. That is splicing together shots. So I'd say architects want to take something away. The stories that I want to see, the stories that most humans want to see, is narrative-based stories. So rather than just doing a, face to camera, talking head sort of thing, take the video out, go from the markets in the morning, riding through their city in Copenhagen and opening up their apartment door. And then that's the story. Like little things like that, where you're telling a story. You still have to have good stories. If you don't have good stories, I don't think it makes good content. It might look okay, but it's not actually good content.
I agree with, here's a tip. Do not get an introverted architect and then put them on a stool. Out of all the framing, that has to be the most awkward way to do an interview. Is you're perched on this bit of timber as if you're a bird. You've never done an interview before in your life, and now you're meant to tell the story. Yeah, you're so right there. Being able to tell that narrative, and it's piecing together that B-roll, it's piecing together the little emotional comments from the architect or the clients and taking them on a journey as if their building is opening up to them, rather than, let me just give you my architect spiel.
And I think what's really interesting about content, so when architects start to think of themselves as content creators, which is not that hard, because what are you creating? Buildings, right? That is the content. And the story behind that becomes the content. If you think of yourself as a content creator and then you go and do something like a video, which may cost you a couple of $1,000s or more, you go, okay, well, what value am I getting out of that? If you get that storytelling right, if you get that video right, you can share it with so many of these publications who don't really want the expense of producing that content themselves. But you also have something that you put on your website, on your social media, that is directly engaging your clients and your staff. So I think starting to think of yourselves as having this amazing piece of content and all you need to do is tell the story and figure out what mediums you want to use, you become incredibly valuable to every publisher because you're producing content that they can use instantly, which is kind of what we've always said at Bowerbird. You want them to be able to take action straight away.
Part of their storytelling is context. We've talked about this before, where it feels like a lot of the projects are in this bubble. You have no idea how it's placed into the larger context. An example might be a little house in a small town an hour away from a big city, and the family leaves the city. They jump in the car and they're escaping the hustle and bustle. They're driving out to this little town, which has a very different character, which reminds me of their childhood. And there's a little coffee shop there. That's where they have their coffee. There's a few locals, and then they've got this little house there. And then you enter the house, and this is why you designed this beautiful thing. So there's just more going on with that house than simply the practical explanation of how you designed it. It's all the other elements which triggers the emotion of why people want to design those homes in the first place. I was just going to say, most people are not designing homes because of just that design process. They're doing it because there's an emotion or a lifestyle, or there's an imagination that goes into what this building will give me, whether that's a getaway from the city or connection to a small community. They're the beautiful stories which tap into a very different narrative.
There are very few projects that are built out there that don't have a story. Like, if you're reverse engineering a story, like if you're trying to make up a story that fits with the end result, I can't believe that was an actual project that got put together. There may be pain involved. You may not want to talk about it, but just finding that story. And often the story, it doesn't have to be necessarily in the construction of that place. Like you're saying, it can be in the utilization, in the enjoyment, in the love of that place. And so find that story. It doesn't matter where it is. That is what is valuable. It's not the photos. It's not just a video of the architecture. It's the story that gives you value to publications, because otherwise they have to generate that stuff themselves. They have to spend a lot more money creating a video, delving into the story, finding all of this stuff out. So if you can present that to them, you're going to be 1,000 times more attractive than someone who isn't providing that content.
There's also a mood which is constantly used in those videos, which is a bit like let's say, the very slow classical music on a very slow panning shot. And you can see why it works, because it's relatively easy to set up the pan shot and you're not relying on humans who mess things up. It's far more difficult to get those beautiful human moments. But what's happening there is everybody starts to fall into the trap of this standardized format, and being able to figure out how you break that not too far, so you can't have it as an abstract movie that nobody can publish, but being able to figure out how you can move that into something that's, again, more emotional, more human, something that more, I guess, the general public can appreciate rather than just the architect.
I think what's interesting about that is it can be formulaic. There's nothing wrong with a formula, right? But there should be formulas that break the mold. So you can have a formula that's like, that's ours, we own that. But just thinking about the formula that exists at the moment, I would say it's production driven, which means that if you haven't got the story, if they can't figure that out, then it's going to come down to the production of that video to do most of the heavy lifting, which is when you end up with those panning shots and, someone talking to camera. Really, all you've got to think about is what's the story? What story can we tell here? And I would say almost every time it's going to be one of two things. It's going to be coming from the context in. So like you were saying, start off at the coffee shop and then come down into the house and retreating away from the world, or the other way around, where you can actually start with detail. So detail might be someone waking up in the morning, walking out to make their coffee, and then they go outside into the nature around their house. And, you can do it one of two ways. But the thing about a formula is it's like narrative, where our brains are trained to do it. How many Hollywood films have you been to where you know what's going to happen because it's following a formula? How many Australian indie films have you been to where you know you're going to be really sad at the end because they have a different formula? Like, it's okay to have the formulas, but just make sure you're getting story as well, because otherwise it's going to be a very pretty production that doesn't actually appeal to anyone.
Yeah. Once you have the recipe, then you can ask yourself, is this a good recipe? And does the recipe serve you? Because there's lots of different recipes, but choosing
Well, I
the
get.
ones
Sorry. Yeah.
in the ones that serve you well. Is it the narrative that you want? Is it the audience you want? And okay, you've been baking chocolate cake every day for a year now. Is there another dish that you could make? I think that's probably a good way of thinking about those formulas.
So looking forward, obviously that's some of the ways that architects can benefit from this stuff. But looking forward, what's the landscape looking like? What's the future of publishing and content looking like?
I think we're going to see that more detailed stories. We can see these pressures coming. So there's quite a few of these publications now are getting away from purely project stories. They're trying to delve into different topics. There's a suggestion of critique, but I don't know how much critique is actually happening. But you definitely see it in things like social issues or just being able to, there's conversations there that are happening. The question with those is whether or not that's directed at architects or the general public. Either way, I think what the architects want to be doing is providing far more nuance and detail with their submissions, allowing their projects to be part of other conversations. I think that's where I would be positioning myself as an architect and trying to figure out what's the bigger conversations happening right now and how does your project fit into that?
I think we talk quite often about there's architectural publishing, which is kind of what we've been talking about. But then there are publications that will publish architecture, that would publish it if only they had access to the architects. And I think that's probably, in my mind, the big opportunity out there is that you're talking about local newspapers, you're talking about, you've built a community football pitch and you need to get into the Football Association magazine to talk about the value of architecture to those communities. Like that to me is the biggest opportunity that's out there, reaching those other audiences. And if you're not telling the stories that are attractive to them, then how are they supposed to write content?
And this is where AI comes in. Ding, ding. We finally got back to AI, Ben.
Yep. That's my bingo card. Yep. Tick.
But AI is one of those forces which is pushing media in that direction because it allows for more detailed stories. It's reducing the cost of creating longer form content with more information. So that's why I would expect publications to start to diversify more and more as they try to figure out what their niche is. At the same time, they've got a balancing act of trying to maintain a large enough audience for those big publications. That's probably the internal conversations they're having, because it's probably not that hard to have a small niche publication, but are you able to attract the masses?
So here's a question for you on AI. Is it going to replace journalists? Is it going to replace editors?
My view for a long time now is that it's amplified intelligence. I think it's going to get rid of any factory worker roles in any industry, whether that's architecture with people doing CAD or building models, and with journalism. If you have a part of your business which has 50 writers who are just grabbing media kits and then repurposing them, I think that's the role it changes. But everything moves upstream where editors can now write more detailed stories without having to have a factory of writers to support them. What that also allows for is more publications on more niche topics. So I think anyone who's in that writer role, I would be thinking about how you move upstream and find your niche. What is it that makes you different? And there's probably a lot of opportunity coming, but there's going to be a shift in that industry.
Yeah, I talk about the value of freelancers to a lot of these traditional print publications, but also online. One of the biggest benefits as a freelance writer is not necessarily your beat. So it's not, I write travel stories. It is going, okay, I'm the only one who can possibly write about design in Iceland. I'm the only one who can write about, who knows everything about coffee shops in Portland. And finding that niche for you that means it's location based. Unless you're sitting across the table from another journalist in that cafe in Portland, you probably have the scoop on whatever story you need to tell around that.
And also getting back to the physical world. So much of journalism has moved online. We have media kits, Bowerbird, all of these tools which facilitate the movement of information. To stand out in that world is you are physically somewhere. You can go interview people. And while that has been pushed out of the market, it's a bit like printed books. You can see why that comes back, because a publication actually has a freelance writer who is in that location to give a different perspective of what it feels like to be in that building. Like all of these things, there's opportunity. It's just change and it's shifting. It's figuring out how to be ahead of that curve rather than feeling like you're on the tail whip of it.
I think the other interesting thing for us to talk about, which may be the last thing now that we're getting up to about the hour mark, is I guess revenue. So rather like coming back to where we started, which is the revenue models of publications, what are the potential future revenue models for publications? Because that list that we went through, events, awards, all of those different things, digital, is that enough? And will it ever be enough for these publishers, or should they be looking for other revenue streams, and what could they potentially be?
Well, I think every publisher right now should be looking for any revenue stream they can. I think they are all in a phase of disruption, and we know that internally from different conversations that there's lots of publishers who are going, how do we navigate this? And essentially, you're taking a bet on something. So diversification, I think, generally is a good idea. You can't rely on the old model to be exactly the same. It may have, the ingredients may still be there, but you're really looking for other opportunities.
Well, I think what's interesting, coming back to that sort of basic definition that we started with, which is a publisher has an audience and then there are people who want access to that audience. I think that is really the value of a publisher. So seeing some of these publishers move into, production roles, things like that, there seems to be value in it. It's great to diversify, but I do wonder whether coming back to the core business and going, okay, how else can we monetize those audiences, or how can we get value from that audience, is really interesting. And I think sometimes the answer is, for a lot of people, is, let's create a members only section. Let's create a paywall here. And the interesting thing about a lot of those is it can actually reduce the size of an audience. It doesn't necessarily increase it. So that's trying to directly monetize through subscriptions. And I think that's probably a much trickier thing. I mean, you can see the biggest newspapers in the world and media organizations in the world still struggle with getting people to pay for their content that they used to get for free. So I think there's definitely value in that audience, and we have some ideas. If you're a publisher, we have some ideas on how you can monetize that audience in a different way. But I think for everyone talking to architects here, support your publications. Like you've got to help them, because this is your only way of marketing what you do.
I agree. I think the architects supporting any publication you can, just think of it as a marketing tax. So buy a subscription to your favorite magazine, pay for paywalls of your favorite online publications, because these are all healthy things for the industry. And for the amount that they cost, it's really, there's no cost to you.
And if you're spending in the vast majority of countries, it's all tax deductible. So keep that in mind.
It's all tax deductible. For a couple $100, you could support a whole range of these services. That's a good thing. You don't want to see a scenario where architectural magazines start to shrink or disappear. Architects don't realize how good they've got it with this entire industry which supports your marketing. In other areas, you would have to spend a fortune to be able to get your name out there. If you were trying to get a product out there, you would be spending tens, hundreds, millions of
It's more just the
dollars.
percentage of your revenue that would go into that, or the percentage of your costs. Like 25% is the lowest, basically, that most companies would spend on their marketing, because you have to do it.
But we're looking into this as well. Like, we can see some models where Bowerbird can plug into publications. So we're having conversations now with different publications, publishers. So we invite anybody to come and tap us on the shoulder. We'd love to chat to you and see if this model would work for you, and just investigating how to adapt to that new market. Because I think it's last year, this year, and maybe the next year is where everyone's going to be putting their bets. Like, what are they going to do? And we're going to see some of these publications not get it quite right. And I think you're going to see some staff drops, and then you're going to see some which really thrive, and they're going to be the winners and demonstrate the new model of how this all stacks up. So again, if you've hedged in a few different ways, you've just got more legs on your table to make sure that you can weather that period of change. And then who knows? We've got to, this seems to go in 10-year cycles, but now with AI just around the corner, who knows if in another 5 years or 3 years, we have to rethink this again.
Quite. So I guess that's the state of architectural publishing as it currently stands.
Fantastic. Well, like always, if you have comments, please leave some comments below wherever you watch this video. And if you're involved in architectural publishing, and we'd probably expand that to design publishing as we start to open up Bowerbird a little bit more.
Or anyone who's interested in publishing architecture and design.
Yes, absolutely. So come and chat to us. We try to meet with people within the industry. And I think at some point, we'll probably start to interview some people on the...
I'm excited to do that, yeah.
Yeah, so rather than you guys having to listen to us every day, you can actually hear from
people love listening to us.
Media expert. Okay, folks.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.